Sorry, you know what? I've been talking away here with my mic muted. So hopefully everybody can hear me now. I thought if somebody could tell me if you can hear. Awesome, all clear. Okay, perfect. So I apologize for that. I thought I had unmuted, but I had not accomplished that. So great. So let me go back and cover what I just said. A few housekeeping details. We are recording today's webinar. The recording is typically posted within 24 hours, so you will automatically get an email notification when it is available. And of course, you should feel free to share that link with other colleagues who might be interested. We are going to be sharing a couple of short videos during today's presentation. If you're in a location that blocks YouTube, you may not be able to see the videos. However, there are links, and those are included in the copy of the slides that are behind the handouts tab. Or when you come back to watch the recording, you'll be able to see it then. So either you can access them one of a couple of ways. Third, we are happy to provide a certificate of participation. If you signed up and requested one, you should get that certificate within about a week. If you don't have it by then, or if you want one but didn't request it, you can just communicate with us via email, and I will be providing my contact information at the end of the webinar. Please feel free to ask questions. As we go along, I will address as many of them as I can. Hopefully as we go along, some of them, but certainly at the end. So we're going to start out this morning, afternoon, or evening, as the case may be, with a little poll. And this will get us started. So here are a bunch of statements about decision making, and just click on the ones that you think are true, that you agree with. So we have 4 different statements here, and hopefully you can see them now, and just feel free to click on the ones that you think are true. Okay, so we're getting some responses now. So, yep, there we're going. We're getting quite a number of responses. I'll give you another minute or so that you can read the statements and think about them. Okay, it looks like we've sort of plateaued out in terms of the numbers of responses. So I am going to close the poll and share the results. And as you can see, they're all saying they can hear now, I think. So, all right, if you're having trouble hearing, and Karen, hopefully my colleague, is on and can chat with you if you're having issues with hearing. So lots of agreement with at least the first 3 statements, and not so much with the 4th, but strong agreement with the first 3. Well, the truth is, at least based on the research that I know of, is that none of these statements is fully true. And the second one, even though almost half of the respondents, half of you, agreed with it, is virtually impossible. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't get better at making decisions, but in order to understand this, we're going to have to dig in to what we know about decision making, and we're going to look at decisions from the perspective of neuroscience, and we're going to talk about the interplay of rationality and our emotions, which are at the very heart of what decisions are all about. Estimates are that as adults, we make about 35,000 decisions every day. If you figure a 16-hour day, that's over 2,000 decisions an hour, 36 decisions a minute, and therefore a decision about every 2 seconds. Many of these decisions are largely unconscious. We decide to reach for a cup of coffee, or we recognize that a piece of debris in the street is a mitten and not a snake or a mouse. And then there are all the decisions that we make that we are conscious of. So here is our plan for today. We're going to talk about 7 keys to better decision making. We're going to talk about the fact that contrary to what many of us think, emotions are always involved in decisions. We will talk about group versus individual decision making, different types of decisions, being conscious of a process to improve our decision making, and factors that will influence how good our decisions turn out to be. And finally, being confident about decisions. I think particularly about Julia's comment about her millennial entrepreneurs who are not always confident. And confidence in decision making is really critical. So let's start with the kind of decisions that many of us make every day. You're going to a meeting where you have to wear a suit. Pretend you're a man if you're not. Which tie will you wear? Has everyone made a decision? If you hadn't made a decision in the 2 or 3 seconds I gave you, why do you think it took you as long as it did? What were you thinking about? Or another one, it's breakfast time. Choose a cereal. Are you ready? What if this was your choice? Easier, of course. But your choice may still not be instantaneous. Why does it sometimes take us so long to make what seems like a simple decision? And what is decision making anyway? We're going to start to answer that with a story about a man named Phineas Gage. Phineas Gage was a construction foreman working on the railways in about the mid-1800s. One day, he was working with dynamite, and there was an explosion, and a tamping bar blasted up through the top of his head. Quite remarkably, he survived. And in most respects, everybody thought he recovered. His intelligence, his speech, his movement were the same, but his behavior completely changed. He became unreliable, and he got angry very easily when someone told him he couldn't do something he wanted to do. His emotions were quite literally out of control. At the time, the field of medicine had little to offer by way of explanation. Since then, of course, neuroscience has been able to identify parts of the brain responsible for working together to enable our decision-making process, our conscious decisions, and how our emotions play into that and how we regulate that. So this next slide is a diagram of a brain as if we had sliced it right down the middle. And so the front of the brain is on the left and the back of the brain is on the right. So the frontal lobes are what are on the left-hand side of the diagram, represent the part of the cortex, which just means the outer layers of the brain, which are generally responsible for making decisions. So when we think about decisions, largely in the front of our brain is where that conscious decision making happens. That's where we also plan, where we control our emotions. And the subcortical structures beneath it, which here you can see the hypothalamus, the amygdala, the hippocampus, those are all part of what we generally refer to as the limbic system. So I'm going to go ahead here and just we're talking about the frontal lobes, and then we're talking about the limbic system, which is where, of course, our emotions happen. And it is the balance and coordination between these two areas that enable us to make effective decisions. Your frontal lobes listen to your emotions, mediate them, and assess the value of that your emotional self assigns to different options in order to make a choice. The trigger for much of this emotional response is this little tiny almond-shaped, that's bigger than it is, but it's right there. It's called the amygdala. It's shaped like a little almond. One thing we know about our frontal lobes that is relevant here is that they do not fully mature until we are well into our 20s, maybe even later. So immature decision-making lacks the balanced assessment that more mature decision-making exhibits. And parenthetically, when we're teenagers, our limbic system is hyped up, and so we tend to make, and our regulatory system in the frontal lobes isn't well developed, so we tend to make even poorer and much riskier decisions, particularly when we're in a social environment. So if your frontal lobes are immature or damaged, decisions may be problematic, or you might have difficulty making a decision at all. There's a patient named Elliot. We all, of course, know the name Phineas Gage now, but Elliot, we don't know what his real name is because he's still alive. But he was leading a normal, productive life. He had a good job, good husband, got along well. Unfortunately, he got a brain tumor, which damaged the frontal lobe in his brain, and which had to be removed along with some brain tissue. Everything, just like Phineas Gage, intelligence, speech, perception, memory were all intact, but he could not plan or decide. His life fell apart. He could think of lots and lots and lots of options to any problem, but was unable to decide among them because his frontal lobe could no longer determine the value of different options. It could no longer read what his emotional system was telling him. Another really important function of your frontal lobes is to help you keep in mind the information that you need to make a decision on. And that function of our brain is actually called working memory. That is to think consciously about something and hold it in our minds. So when we're making a decision, we hold various alternatives in working memory as we actively think about them. We can easily hold two serial options in working memory. And that's one of the reasons that choice between Cheerios and Honey Nut Cheerios would be so much easier than the choice if we had lots and lots and lots of serial options. Most people can't hold more than about 6 or 7 things in working memory at a time. But if we chunk information, as I've done on this slide, we can still hold 6 or 7 chunks of information. So maybe if we divide the cereals into unsweetened and pre-sweetened, or oat, corn, wheat, and rice, we can probably hold these options in our mind and start to narrow it down. So whenever you're making a decision with lots and lots of alternatives, it makes good neurological sense to write them down and or to group them into a more manageable number to think about. Now, it's not just our frontal lobes that we need to be concerned about here, because remember, we talked about the interplay. So we've talked about how our frontal lobes are involved in decisions, but it also turns out that damage to the parts of our brain that process emotions rather than regulating them can have a very similar effect. And this is fascinating. So here's an experiment that was performed with individuals who had damage to their amygdala. That, of course, is the part of the brain, that little almond-shaped part that signals emotion, and particularly danger, in combination with the hypothalamus. So what they've done is experiments and studies using what is known as the Iowa card sort test. And in this test, subjects are presented with several different decks of cards. Some are blue, some are red. Each card has a monetary outcome on it. So their subjects are told that some of the decks are good and some of them are bad, but they don't know which is which. And what they do is they start to draw cards for a set number of terms and deciding each time which deck to take a card from. The good decks are constructed so that the average gain for a card is $50. 10% of the cards represent a $250 loss. So if you randomly drew 10 cards from that deck, you would, on average, net a $250 gain. Not bad. The bad decks had a higher average gain per card, but they were also more risky because the amount of losing cards is greater. And so on this one, on average, if you drew 10 cards randomly from these blue decks, you would come out with a $250 loss. So obviously, over time, you would hope that any rational person experimenting this, while they might be attracted by that $100 gain on a card, would realize that over time they're losing money. And in fact, this is pretty much what they have shown. So what you're seeing here is the results over a series of card drawing for normal patients versus those who had lesions or had their amygdala removed. So remember, their frontal lobes are intact, but what they're not getting is that emotional signal. And what they've shown is that the more cards they draw, the better normal individuals get at figuring out which the good decks are and sticking with them to their advantage. But the individuals without amygdala signals couldn't do that. Their bodies weren't signaling them about the risk involved in their behavior. So the interplay between emotion and rationality is critical in decision making. You can't eliminate either one. If you aren't incorporating emotion, you literally can't fall off the fence on one way or the other. If you can't regulate and observe your process on the other side, you are likely to engage in very risky and damaging behavior or be simply unable to decide at all. So let's talk a little bit about how we do that, how we regulate our thought processes, and how our frontal lobes interact with our emotional signals. Up to this point, we've talked about several types of damaged brains because those are the ones that create the starkest differences and where we really can see what can go wrong when we're not, our brain circuits are not well functioning. But of course, most of us don't bring damaged brains to our decision-making processes. What we do bring is our executive functions. This is a term that is used to describe the directive capacities of our minds. And we've already mentioned the first one, working memory. In the context, it's, of course, holding information in our minds while we think about it. So in the context of decision-making, working memory is where we hold multiple options in our minds while we consider them. It is how we keep track of where we are in our decision-making process, and we'll talk more about that process later. Inhibitory control is pretty much what it sounds like. It's how we control or modulate or regulate what we would otherwise do in the moment. So, for example, if I get mad at somebody and I just feel like punching them in the nose, of course, I'm going to restrain myself from doing that, and that's inhibitory control. But it can be much more subtle than that. It can be suppressing certain options that are not attractive out of the ones we're thinking about. It can be deferring gratification over time in pursuit of a overriding goal. And then the third is cognitive flexibility. This is how we remain open to alternative options and model what the world would look like if we chose different ones. And going back and forth between a focus on one decision to expanding possibilities. And we will typically do that, especially if it's a really important decision. We'll go back and forth between trying to create multiple options and analyze those versus digging deeply down into the consequences and the value of a particular option. And that going back and forth is cognitive flexibility. So these are all important processes, and this is really how our frontal lobes going about doing that. Now, remember that we talked about the fact that this part of our brain is typically not fully mature until we're at least in our mid-20s and possibly even later. There's also increasing evidence that it's not just age and experience that can develop them further, that there are actually some forms of cognitive training that can make these processes stronger and more efficient. So while we're going to focus on keys to decision-making today, if anybody would like to hear more information on cognitive training for executive functions, please just type a note into the chat window and we'll follow up and provide some more information specifically on that. But the next key, so that's the first key, was really understanding the interaction between emotion and rationality, and that we need both physically, neurologically in our decision-making process in order to balance our decision-making. But there's some other things that our brains do non-consciously. And so the second key is recognizing what are often referred to as decision traps. Now, you may have heard about some of these. They're always entertaining, and most of us shake our heads and go, would I really do that? But the fact of the matter is, these are things, again, that happen in our brains non-consciously. The first kind of decision trap is called an anchor. And here I'll give you an example. So when I do this with a large group in person, like as I do in the MBA classes that I teach, I put 2 questions on slips of paper. Half of the audience gets one slip and half the 2 questions on the left, and the other half gets the 2 questions on the right. And I ask them to write down the answers to both questions. I tell them not to talk to each other or to look it up on a smartphone or the internet, since they often have their computers with them. Just guess. Then what happens is that somebody collects the slips of paper and writes down their estimates of the population in 2 columns. So what do you think? Do you think there will be any differences between the guesses of the group that get the questions on the left versus the questions on the right? Well, you're probably going to guess that there are, and there are indeed. So the guesses from those who get the questions, whether the population was greater than 9 million, on average, guess lower numbers than do those who get the second question. The actual number, by the way, is about 19 million. And why is this difference? Because 9 million and 30 million serve as anchors. They serve as ways of fixing our consideration set in a certain range, even though we aren't even aware of it. Now, if you know the population of Chile, of course, you're not going to be fooled by this. But if it's something, and I typically choose a country that people might have some general ideas about, but where the group of people don't know for sure, because then those anchors really influence their responses. Here's another example. Would you prefer a milkshake that is 90% fat-free or one that is 10% fat? Of course, these are actually the exact same milkshakes, of course, but almost everyone would choose the one that is 90% fat-free. And again, this is language that serves as an anchor that we prefer one over the other, even though they're explaining essentially the same thing. So when you're making a decision, think about different ways to ask the question. When you see an anchor, take that into consideration and say, what would it be like if that piece of information weren't there? Another type of, a similar type of decision trap is called a framing trap. And our answers to questions, as you know, you all are aware of, you can do polls or surveys of people in the street, and depending on how you ask the question, you will get very, very different kinds of answers. But this is a real story, a true example. So there were New Jersey and Pennsylvania a few years ago decided that they wanted to tackle the problem of rising insurance costs, auto insurance. And they passed very similar laws. And each law gave drivers the option to accept a limited right to sue, and then they would have a lower premium. So they didn't have all the options they did before, but their auto insurance costs would be substantially less. But they took different approaches in terms of how they implemented it. In New Jersey, you automatically got the limited right to sue unless you specified otherwise. And in Pennsylvania, nothing changed unless you opted in to that limited right to sue. So what percentage do you think chose the new option? And you're probably going to guess that because we framed the question differently and you had to be proactive one way or the other, that it was quite different. And in fact, it was really dramatic. It was in the New Jersey case where you automatically got it, 80% opted into that right for limited suit. And in Pennsylvania, it was only 25%. So cautionary tale for our legislators and others and our regulators if you want to encourage a certain kind of behavior, you have to frame it very carefully that way. Another decision trap that people are often aware of and has had a lot of discussion about is called the overconfidence bias. And all this means, it's pretty important, is we tend to be overconfident about our own abilities and our knowledge. And it's be surprising to you in the kinds of realms that this has an impact. So if you take all of the people who drive in the country and you were somehow able to rate them on how good they are, whether they're good, safe drivers or not, half, of course, would be below average and half would be above average. Well, how many drivers do you think feel that they're above average drivers? Feel free to type your guesses into the chat window. I'm interested to see what you come up with. Oh my gosh, you guys are awesome. 75, 90, 95%. The answer is 93%. So, of course, only 50%, but 93% of us believe that we're in the top half. How many drivers do you think feel that they're in the top 30%? So not just the, better than half of the people, but now we're saying, I am a better driver and a safer driver than 70%. And the answer here is a little bit lower than the first one, but the actual answer is 82%. So we're highly overconfident in terms of our knowledge and our abilities. Now I'm going to give you one more example. And you can all participate in this, hopefully without looking it up on the internet. How many works of musical works do you think Johann Sebastian Bach composed? And what I want you to do is write down a lower limit and an upper limit to your estimate so that you're 98% confident. You're not 100% confident, but you're pretty darn confident that the actual number is within your range. Okay, so we've got some brave people providing lower and upper limits. And I'm keeping an eye on those. Now, so what would happen is if we had 100 people on this webinar, and in fact, we actually do have over 100 people on this webinar. So if everybody responded and everybody could estimate based on that 98% confidence level, then only 2 of the 100 people would be wrong, right? Because for 98% confidence, on average over time, we're going to be right 98% of the time. When I do this in a group, usually more than half are wrong. And I'm not going to count up right now, but I will tell you that the correct answer is 1,127. So if your range was big enough to include that number, then you can feel very good about your ability to manage your overconfidence. One more type of decision trap. Imagine to yourself that you've just found out that a distant uncle whom you never met and you didn't even know has left you 100 shares of Alibaba stock. Will you sell or keep the shares? So just think about that. You can type in, or you can, everybody wants us to know. Keep them until they're worth more. Keep, sell. We've got a whole combination there. So Alibaba stock is currently trading at about $186 a share. So your inheritance is worth $18,600. Tidy sum. Be pretty excited if that happened to me. But let's think about the question now from a different perspective. If you received $18,600, would you go out and buy Alibaba stock? So last spring, when I asked this question to my MBA students, Alibaba stock was trading at 74 a share. And now I know that I should have gone out and bought some, but I didn't. And that's another story. But here, this is actually called the status quo bias. So the status quo bias simply means that if we have something, we're not inclined to change that. We're inclined to keep the status quo. And this is just something that our brains tend to do. It takes energy to change. And we'll talk about that some more when we do that. And I see Susan's raising a hand. If you have a question, please just feel free to go in and type it. So if we have a different answer, if we just received the money, than when we kept it, then we have to be aware that there's something in that situation of having something that just encourages us to not change the status quo. So avoiding decision traps. You cannot completely avoid them because they are non-conscious. But to the extent that you can start to become aware of them, you can mitigate the risk. And you can check facts, you can check assumptions, you can look information up, you consider other ways to define the problem. So as we did with the Alibaba shares of stock, or as we did with the how much of the milkshake is fat, think of a way to turn around the question. Think of a way to pull out the anchor and just have a very straightforward question. And that will help you avoid decision some of these decision traps. Another way is to use a group decision-making process, especially if it's a consequential or high-risk decision. And having a group can sometimes often help you about eliminate some of these because people can sort of check on each other and have more information. So the third key is about whether two heads are better than one. In general, there is wisdom in crowds, and groups generally make better decisions than individuals do. But it's not always the case, of course. So, for example, if you have a group with one person who has dramatically more expertise than the others, then that person might make a better decision than the group as a whole. I see this actually quite regularly in an exercise that I do in my MBA class around this whole concept of whether, and if I have somebody who's really expert in this thing, they often get sort of overruled by the group decision. But in general, in the right circumstances, group decisions often yield more knowledge, more alternatives, and therefore a better decision. So in particular, when you have a situation that requires group buy-in, of course, unilateral decisions are not going to make a lot of sense. So there's been a lot of research on the value of decision-making in groups. Here's one using an experiment called the Centipede game. And basically, without going into a long, drawn-out explanation, each side takes turns, and the amount of coins keep increasing as they do. Each person, as on their turn, can decide whether to take the bigger bunch of coins and then the other side gets the smaller bunch of coins. And if you think through this very, very rationally, then what you find out is that the most optimal, the most advantageous decision is to take the group of coins at your first opportunity. And what they found, however, is that the groups tend to get to that solution quicker. So neither individuals nor groups, on average, fully complied with the optimal solution, but groups do get there faster and exit the game earlier to their advantage than individuals do. Now, I'm going to show you just one example of what can happen when you don't have, when you have an individual making a decision where arguably you might make a better decision in a group. Okay, well, you get the idea, and I encourage you to watch the video. I believe it ends up around $40. But of course, that's just, I think, a great example of what happens when an individual is involved in a situation. I really can't think through rationally what the situation is. And that's where two heads really can be better than one. And so what I'd like to do is just share some group decision-making processes that often are helpful in organizations. Consensus is the first on the list, and it is the default decision-making process in most organizations. Everybody sits around the table, they discuss the question, they gradually emerge with a consensus. The process isn't always effective, though, especially if one or two people dominate the discussion, or if some participants are uncomfortable sharing information or views with the group. Sometimes in a consensus process, the groups don't go beyond the first idea, or there starts to be groupthink. You've probably all been in similar situations, but it serves us well in a lot of ways. As I said before, it can often be the case that the majority will ignore an expert or override their opinion. So it doesn't always produce an optimal decision. And there's some other processes that can actually address some of those concerns. This is a process that I call 136. In this process, each member of a group writes down his or her ideas and what they think the solution might be. Then 3 members of the group combine their ideas into an idea or solution that represents those members' ideas. So everybody's got a voice, but you don't have to necessarily express it in the full group. And then 2 3-member groups combine, and the 6-member group reports out what their group solution is. So this approach makes sure that everyone is focused on the problem and thinking through their point of view. When you write it down, it consolidates it, it makes it a little bit more firm, and it makes it more likely that minority opinions get expressed and that less likely the good ideas get suppressed. I use this in professional development a lot to reinforce what the group has learned, and so people share their learnings and then develop a group. So when you rehearse that information, it's more likely to stick with you. You've all probably done dot voting. That's another group decision-making process, or post-it note voting sometimes. When a group is dealing with many possible alternatives, multivoting is a good way to narrow down the options. It also frequently uncovers closely related or redundant options that can be combined. And in this process, as you've probably experienced it, you get a certain number of dot stickers, and you get to vote for the ideas you think are the best. Sometimes it can be used to come up with the final solution, but often just used to narrow down the options. Another group decision-making process that I think is really fascinating is, and it's useful when you have a lot of experts, it's called the Delphi Method. And essentially here, each of those experts is their own oracle at Delphi, and they have something important to say. And so the question goes out from the center, and independent, without consulting each other, the experts answer it, and the responses all come back to the center. Sometimes that's where it stops, although another version of the process then consolidates the responses and sends them back out for further review and comment until an answer or answers emerge. This can be really, really effective. You're also probably familiar with the concept of a devil's advocate. This is certainly a way to combat groupthink when you assign the role of challenging assumptions to one person, or switch the role around ideally, because nobody wants to always be the devil's advocate. And while it does help to make sure that different ideas get surfaced, I've seen often where somebody will sort of get stuck in that role, and you just know when you go into the meeting that who it is who's going to be the fly in the ointment, and who has difficulty shifting back into a more collegial and collaborative role, is just always too ready to play the devil's advocate. And a way of sort of incorporating that, and taking advantage of the good aspects of that, is a process called easy for me to say, 6 thinking hats. And I just want to mention this briefly. By the way, there's a short description of all of these decision-making processes in one of the handouts. And basically what happens with this process is that everyone in the group puts on the same colored hat at the same time. A white hat during this part of the discussion, you're surfacing all the known facts. When it's the red hat, you're documenting the feelings and emotions associated with the decision. And these are factors that often are overlooked in other decision-making processes. The green hat is for creativity, the yellow for benefits. So here you're looking at the pros of an idea. The black is the negatives. That's sort of the akin to the devil's advocate role. And then the blue hat makes sure that you follow the process so that everybody, when they're in that creativity part of the discussion, should be supporting that, not trying to put the black hat or the white hat on, that you really want to be about the idea generation at that point. So again, all of these are described briefly, but I really encourage you to think about trying some of these. For one thing, people get tired of the same decision-making processes and often really welcome the opportunity to try something new. And I think you'll also find, depending on your organization and the situation, that some of these can be even more effective than our default standard of consensus. The next key I want to talk about is that, of course, decisions are radically different. And, you know, that's pretty obvious. I think we all are aware of that. Although sometimes those simple decisions, like which cereal, can take us longer than it probably should. And here's, you know, some of the ways that we can think about this, and that if we're aware of these, then we can treat the decisions in the way that we should. So is this a routine decision? Have I seen this before? Or is this a novel decision where we've never been through this? Obviously, it's going to require a different approach. Does it only affect me, or does it affect others? That has a lot to say about who needs to participate in the decision and how you need to think about, and whether it can be changed or whether it's a permanent. Can I go back and make a different choice later? So these hard decisions, of course, are the ones where we all can get to the point where we can make some of those easy ones. But the harder decisions, and these tend to be characteristic of big strategic decisions. And I think that there were a number of people who registered today who are probably confronted with these kinds of decisions, maybe on a fairly regular basis, where you have a lot of unknowns. It's very complex, high risk consequences. You don't even know what the alternatives are. It's not like someone gives you two cereals to choose from, lots of stakeholders. And not only do you need to have a good solution, but it needs to be better than your competitors. And this is a chart that I find to be very helpful in trying to sort these out and figure out what kind of decision you're involved in. And basically it divides different types of decisions based on two dimensions. One is whether your performance is relative, that is, are you competing with somebody else, or is it absolute? And the other dimension is, do you have any control over the alternatives that you select and how you implement it after you make the decision? If you have low control, it's one thing. If you have a lot of control, it's the other. And we can think of examples of all of these. This all comes from a Harvard Business Review article called "What Makes Strategic Decisions Different," which I think is an excellent article and really talks about these different types of decisions and then how to address them. And keys to making these decisions, of course, are figuring out what you know and what you don't know, what you have to assume, because we always, especially in decisions where there's a lot of uncertainty, we're not going to be able to know everything. We're going to have to make some assumptions. We need to understand the context in the given. So if there's a mission, a vision, values, goals that are preset, we have to create those. We have to understand those and what the context is that we're making the decision in. Defining the right problem. I think of all of this list of keys to those making those really complex decisions, there are two that I would highlight and that I find in my work with my MBA students and with my colleagues in business are really fundamental and really critical. And that is defining the right problem. And the other one is generating good alternatives. So smart business people will often see a situation and they will draw analogies to previous experiences they've had, and they will go directly towards a solution. MBA students in particular just they can make a decision, they can make a choice, and they can come up with a solution faster than you can shake a stick. But what they do struggle with is generating alternatives. And generating alternatives is really absolutely key. When you get to the end of your process and you have a proposed decision, make sure that you can adequately answer the question, what else did you consider and why did you reject those options? Because you may not have optimized your decision if you can't do that. This sort of implies, of course, I think this is maybe sort of restating what we just talked about, but the process does matter. And having people feel that they participated in the process and understand the steps, this happens to come from the process steps that are provided by a website called Mind Tools. This link at the bottom is a link to an online quiz where you can sort of check out your own decision-making skills and maybe figure out where you're stronger, where you're weaker. I know that my MBA students often find this to be very helpful. They get some insights into where they are typically focused. And while people sort of tend to focus on the actually selection, the choosing, the deciding part of it, there are steps before that and steps after that that are going to be important. Coming back to a little bit of neuroscience here, there's actually some situations where we really don't want to make decisions. If we are counting on good decisions to be made when our frontal lobes and our emotions are talking to each other and collaborating, I can tell you that there are some situations where they don't do that very well. One is when you need sleep. There's a lot of research that's been done that says basically if you've been awake for 19 hours, you will perform cognitively as if you were legally intoxicated. When you're stressed or hungry or when you're experiencing really strong emotions, that will have a negative influence on your ability to make that balanced, rational, emotional decision. And there's a lot of research on all of these things. So if you have a big decision to make, get a good night's sleep, meditate or exercise or do something else to reduce stress, eat a good breakfast, and take a few deep breaths. The research on sleep is particularly fascinating. And many of us try to burn the candle at both ends and don't get enough sleep. You can see research about that all the time too. But what we know is that performance on problem solving and deciding improves after you've slept versus staying awake. And it turns out that this is especially true for difficult problems. It actually doesn't make as much difference when the problems are fairly simple or when they're not all that difficult. But we always tell each other, well, why don't you go sleep on that problem? There's actually a very valid neurological reason, and the research would certainly support that. The last key is I want to come back to this question of confidence. And we talked about how to reach a balanced decision, how to make the process rational and diligent. We've cautioned against overconfidence. But what I'd like to do is share this short video, and then we'll wrap up. So here we do that. This is Professor Babashev from Stanford. Okay, so we have talked about, there we get a very clear expression of exactly what's happening and why sometimes emotion, in fact, often emotion, and why the key to a successful decision has to do, in many respects, with confidence. We've talked about how to reach a balanced decision, how to make the process both rational and diligent, and we certainly want that. But we also want to be confident in our decisions, because when we come out of the decision-making process and we are able to support them energetically or even passionately, because that is what inspires everyone around us. And that is what gives us the drive and the energy, including investors or customers or colleagues or students or employees or whoever it may be. In fact, we can't make decisions without emotion. We can't know in advance whether a decision will work out or not, but we can have a good process, good information, good ideas. And so the way that we reconcile these is if we think about it very objectively and deliberately. We have a group around us to help us avoid decision traps and all those kinds of things. And we can emerge with full commitment, with a positive attitude while taking the action. And then at some point, of course, we need to step back and do some dispassionate analysis later to see whether we're accomplishing our goals. And of course, this is not always easy to do. It takes a fair amount of cognitive flexibility, those executive functions we were talking about, to be able to alternate between the passionate drive that comes out of the decision-making process in a very complex environment. So I think we have, I've managed to use up our time, but we did start a minute or two late. So I'm going to just give people an opportunity to see if there are questions. I'm happy also to address questions afterwards or via email and things like that. So I want to give you a chance to ask any questions. Alibaba is an internet search engine that's very prevalent outside the US, it's particularly in Asia. I should have explained that probably. All right. All right, I'm not seeing any questions. We'll leave it open. I want to really thank everybody for being part of our presentation today. Any frameworks for decision making? I would suggest Mind Tools is a pretty good one. And then there are lots of models and frameworks for particular aspects of decisions and analysis. So Theodore, if you could email me a little bit more detail about that question, I may be able to direct you. What is my one piece of advice? Try out some of those group decision-making processes and get some experience with them. Listen to your gut. I'm going to give you two pieces of advice, I guess, that you can't make a rational decision without your gut, and you can't make a gut decision without thinking about the alternatives and adding some rationale in there. And don't feel like you have to just, calculate a purely objective, that recognizing that our emotions are essential to our decision making, then that's probably my best advice. Oh, we're getting so many, especially between decision-making process and EEG. I don't know that off the top of my head, but I will. Hi, Sam. You might be able to tell me that. All right, someone else has suggested a framework for decision-making, so I certainly encourage everybody. I'm not familiar with that, but certainly encourage people to take a look at that, and I will look at that. Is emotional intelligence related? Yeah, all of intelligence is related to this. Emotional intelligence is part of it, and has to do, again, with the interaction between our own emotional states and our ability to sort of take a look at them objectively and understand our own emotions, and also develop empathy and understanding others' emotions and connect them. So emotional intelligence involves working memory. It involves understanding our own emotional states and triggers and all of those kinds of things, and practice in those processes of inhibitory control, cognitive flexibility, and all those kinds of things. So those are very definitely connected. All right, lots of different questions. I will try to follow up on some of these, but we have overrun our time a little bit, and I just want to say thank you very, very much to everybody for participating today. It was great to have you part of this, and we look forward to continuing the discussion as we go forward, and hope to see you at another webinar sometime soon. Oh, take care and have a great day.